Sociology of Culture, Soc 419 for the winter-spring semester 2012. I'm Gary Adler. It's nice to meet you. Over the course of the semester, through these video lectures, you're going to see a lot of me, but I may not see a lot of you. That's just fine, but what I like to do in these video lectures is to have some sort of interaction in some way, so that you aren't merely just reading notes that I send you or just reading posts online, but to actually get a sense of how to use some of the concepts that we're learning about, and indeed to be introduced to a kind of whole wide range of material. I have to, because of YouTube, and I can't plunk down a whole chunk of change to have the channel where you can put an hour-long video, I have to split this up into 15-minute segments. So what I usually try to do is kind of encapsulate those segments, try not to end right in the middle of a thought, but sometimes that does happen. And then I'll stop, restart the next segment where I left off. I've got a whiteboard, as you can see here. What I'll try to do at the beginning of lectures is to give a quick little outline, maybe I didn't use the best font today, of what I'm going to do for the lecture. And then as I go through the lecture, you oftentimes see me erasing and using the dry erase markers. So really quickly this week, so that you see, I'm going to go over a little conceptual background of what we mean when we say culture. Especially if you've taken sociology classes before, you might have a really good familiarity for concepts such as structure or class or gender. But this word culture is a particularly difficult one to dive into. So really the first week and the second week, we're at the beginning of the second week now, are really the times for us to explore a little bit some of what I call our common sense understandings, as well as some of the history within the study of culture that we're laden with in some ways. We don't want to say that all that's bad, but we also want to be clear of all those things so that as we get into the sociological analysis of culture, we have much better tools to work with in what we do. So I'll go over some of that background. I'll give you a working definition of culture. It's more, definition might be too specific a word, but you'll see when we get there. I'll give you some kind of things to keep in mind or methods of approach as we go throughout the rest of the semester. And then I'll do kind of a quick syllabus review. These lectures usually last somewhere between 40 minutes to an hour. And by now, you've basically seen the layout of this course. Each week will begin with a lecture that I put up. You'll have your readings set in your syllabus, and then by Thursday at 11:59, notice it's not midnight, it's 11:59. Don't get caught that way. You'll always either have an online discussion due or a reading quiz due. And then after that, I do the grading and the following weekend, and I do some wrap-up notes. All of this material is of a piece. In other words, it's all part of the study of culture, and we're going to be covering lots of different ways of approaching culture and thinking about culture within sociology. So keep up, don't fall behind. And everything is fair game for any of the exams that we do. So pop quizzes, I'm going to focus on stuff from that week, but the midterm exam, everything is game that we're covering in the course. So before I go any further though, let me just say I hope you've had a wonderful day celebrating Martin Luther King. I'm working today, because I wanted to get this up in case some of you are going to be tuning into this evening and getting a little work done before the regular work week starts. But for sociologists, this is a terrific holiday because it's a holiday in a lot of ways that emphasizes the transformative potential that is embedded within ourselves and within our society. If we can only, and this is what sociology is about, if we can only discover the ways to make that happen, if we can only discover the ideas, the methods, the way to think about the social world, the way to work together to make those sorts of incredible transformations happen. So I hope you've been able to celebrate the day a little bit. Sometimes I like to go to on this day, there's a wonderful website at Stanford University, I think it might be called the Dr. Martin Luther King Project, where they've actually collected all his various papers and speeches and letters, and you can go on there and read the whole things or snippets of them. It's really terrific to just kind of drop in there and see some of his writing and some of his thinking. Kind of refreshes you, gets you going in this new year, this new semester. So let me dive in a little bit to this conceptual background that I mentioned here. Give me a second while I erase. And as you've no doubt figured out by now, Some people like to call you the YouTube generation, that you can pause at will, that if you hit a certain part of the lecture that's dry, or you just need to go finish a workout, or the kids are crying and you got to serve dinner, you can just pause, come back to these whenever. I leave these up all semester long, so it's not a problem. We've seen from our first week reading that culture is actually a fairly complicated concept. And so as I said, in these first 2 weeks, what I'm trying to do is kind of disentangle those strands to help you not be so confused. But as I do this, please don't be too tuned in to trying to nail down, especially here at the beginning of our course, what exactly we mean by culture. Because as you're going to see, that's been one of the struggles within sociology of culture and how we think about culture and society. It's to look at the complexity of this concept and to realize that approaches before, or common sense approaches, don't actually fully flesh out this concept and help us think about how culture really works in the world and what it means. So don't be afraid of complexity. Don't be afraid if you feel like there's not a simple answer coming out of the gate, okay? Just want to put that out there for you. And let me then make things a little bit more complex by giving you some conceptual background. The first of these we noticed in our Spillman reading was that there's kind of we'll call it an old anthropological. And by old, we're talking 19th century, that's 1800s. Kind of an old anthropological concept of culture. And the quick history lesson here is for those of you who don't know, the 1700s and the 1800s see a couple of huge transformations in Western civilization. And that's important. We're kind of talking about the Western world. In this particular case. And what do we see? We see the dual revolution, which is kind of the revolutions of democratic practice, especially in the United States and France, and then throughout Western Europe in the 1800s. And we also see the Industrial Revolution. But of course, even predating those, what we have is kind of the great era of colonial expansion that ends up in basically subjugation of native lands, as we well know, and reclaiming or claiming those lands under authorities, political and religious ideas of authority from Europe. In that period of kind of encounter, or I should say increased encounter with other parts of the world, you have the beginning of thinkers in the 1800s to kind of try and make sense of these differences, make systematic sense of these differences that they're encountering as they travel the world. And then in the 1800s, this is heightened, this area of colonialism in two ways. It's heightened because the 1800s is actually solidification of a lot of colonies in Africa and South America, despite the fact that in what is now the United States, the colonial era was more or less over. In the 1800s in Europe, you have heightened colonization in outside of Europe by European countries, Italy, Germany, Spain, and so on. And you have the emergence of those as coherent nation states with central governing authorities, structures of politics and economics. And so you begin to also have this differentiation between countries in Europe as to what characterized them. And you have this fun, friendly little word, folk. You start to see in the 1800s this sense of that nations are a collection of a folk, and that this collection has some set of characteristics, ways of thinking, doing, and believing that defines it in opposition to other folk, other collections of people. And folk, from the German word Volk, V-O-L-K, basically means kind of a people. Now, we could go on and on about how inaccurate these self-conceptions were, and how inaccurate trying to trace them into genetics became. You can think of Hitler and the Third Reich as kind of the pinnacle and simultaneously the ditch of this thinking, trying to think of a folk that is held together by some essence. But still, you see the example here, which is in the 1800s, you have people wanting to distinguish between these countries by saying we're a folk, we're held together by certain things. And this thing, if you will, was the culture. So this anthropological concept, as we've seen in the reading, is comparative, and it brings this idea of a set of people in which culture kind of holds the whole group together. And, not surprisingly then, at the base of the word culture, you might have noticed this already, is the root cult. And cult literally was kind of a term of analysis for kind of proto-historians and proto-sociologists in the 1800s. And they were talking about kind of the activities, the ritual activities of a group of people. And this group of people they could refer to as a cult, similar to this idea of folk. So what we're seeing here is naming of groups, a folk or a cult, and then naming of certain essences or characteristics of these groups. That came to be, in this anthropological sense, of what culture meant. And colonizers, travelers, traveling capitalists, missionaries used these kind of concepts of folk, cult, of coherent groups and comparison to understand what they were encountering and to understand what they were conquering throughout the world. Some key aspects of this approach to culture, it doesn't usually say much about connections between what they say are the characteristics of culture and things like economics or historical analysis. They're associated, as I've said, with defined groups, often limited to a nation or a race. This is the era in which even the idea of race begins to be risen up as some sort of defining characteristics that allows you to draw lines between groups of people. In this concept, culture, the cultural characteristics are eternal and unchanging. So in this way of arguing, the German Volk have been the same throughout all the time. And it's something literally in the blood that keeps this group of people different. And then there's an assumption, especially as people go from these core European countries outwards to other parts of the world, that there are developmental stages of culture. So of course, not surprisingly, the European powers would think somehow they've reached this pinnacle of cultural development up here. And as they go traveling, they find that, whoa, lo and behold, we're encountering all these other folk, all these other cultures out there in the world, and we think that they don't show near the progress and near the development that we have in our own country. So this is kind of a dominating way of thinking in the West in the 1800s, and which is the exact moment in the rise of anthropology, because anthropology is really a discipline to try and make sense of the differences that are being encountered outside of Western Europe. And anthropology finally, by the kind of 1930s, as we'll read in the Ruth Benedict reading for this week, finally starts to ditch this concept. So let me make really clear that this is not the way anthropologists think now, but it was in the founding of their discipline a way of thinking. Actually, it's the opposite of how a lot of anthropologists think now, but it's important to see that the word culture has these connotations and actually is said a lot in common discourse today. When we say things like culture, we're often using it in kind of this older anthropological sense. And then the classic demolition of this way of thinking about culture is Said's 1978 book. This is the famous book, if you can Google it, it's called Orientalism, where Said takes us through the idea of the development of the Orient, right? There's supposedly this Oriental culture, and Said carefully shows that it's a concept that is built on the travels and occupying dynamics of Western powers as a way to try and categorize, claim, and control a whole swath of people. And so he deconstructs this idea of the Orient as some sort of comprehensive entity and shows that really this whole process of talking about these coherent cultures that are natural essences of people is incorrect. So that's some of the anthropological deep baggage that's coming in to our thinking about the way of culture, and we're going to want to try and move that to the side. Now let me pause here and I'll come right back and talk about another concept of